She walked out of Ironwood Veterans Medical Center with her badge in one hand and nothing else. No box of belongings, no farewell, just the sound of her own footsteps on wet pavement and the distant hum of the parking garage fluorescents flickering above her. 29 years old, first day, fired in front of 30 people before she'd even charted her first patient. Nobody came after her. Nobody even watched her go. But 23 minutes later, a military convoy blew through the hospital's east gate at 50 miles an hour. 3 black vehicles, no civilian plates, soldiers hanging out of windows with weapons drawn. And the moment the lead truck skidded to a stop under the emergency bay canopy, a colonel in full combat dress jumped out and grabbed the nearest staff member by the collar. "I need Claire Bennett," he said. "Right now, where is she?" The charge nurse stared at him. "She doesn't work here." The colonel's jaw tightened. "I didn't ask if she works here. I asked where she is. If you've made it this far, don't leave. Follow my channel, hit like, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels." Now, let's go back to where it all started. The morning had begun the way most disasters do, quietly, without any indication of what was coming. Claire Bennett arrived at Ironwood Veterans Medical Center at 6:47 a.m., 13 minutes before her scheduled orientation, because she was the kind of person who showed up early, not to impress anyone, but because standing around waiting made her anxious. She wore her dark hair pulled back tight, no jewelry, sensible shoes that she'd broken in months ago. The badge they'd mailed her was clipped to her chest. Claire Bennett, RN, float staff. And she stood at the main entrance reading the hospital directory like she was memorizing it. Ironwood was a veterans facility. She'd known that when she applied. 42 beds in the ICU alone, a trauma bay that served 3 counties, and a reputation for attracting the kind of surgeons who went to conferences and came back with opinions. The parking lot had a flagpole with 2 flags and a small stone monument near the entrance that she paused in front of for a moment before going inside. She didn't tell anyone why she paused. She never did. The charge nurse on the ICU floor was a woman named Donna Reyes, mid-50s, reading glasses on a beaded chain, the look of someone who had weathered 12 administrators and had outlasted all of them. She handed Claire a stack of orientation paperwork without looking up. "Float staff. That means you go where I put you. You don't argue assignments, you don't go off protocol, and you don't bother Dr. Holloway unless he asks you a direct question." Donna finally glanced up. "You understand what I mean by that?" "I think so," Claire said. "That's not a yes." "Yes," Claire said. "Good. Bay 4 needs vitals. Dr. Kellerman will be rounding in 20 minutes. Try not to be memorable." It was not exactly a warm welcome, but Claire had received worse. She took the paperwork, tucked it under her arm, and went to find Bay 4. The ICU at Ironwood was arranged in a horseshoe pattern, nursing station at the center, patient bays around the perimeter, a glass-walled consultation room at the far end that the senior physicians used when they wanted to look like they were working. Claire moved through the space with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been in chaotic rooms before and knew that the fastest way to be useful was to stay invisible until you weren't. Bay 4 held a 63-year-old post-op patient named Mr. Arturo Villanueva. Inguinal hernia repair, 20 hours out of surgery, vitals stable on paper, but something about his color wasn't right. She took his pressure, took it again, checked his output numbers on the chart. She stood there for a moment, looking at the numbers and then looking at him. "You're a new one," Mr. Villanueva said. He had a raspy voice and the careful eyes of someone who'd spent a lot of time deciding who to trust. "First day," she said. "They always put the new ones with me. Think I'm easy." He almost smiled. "Am I easy?" "I don't know yet." She made a note in the chart, then paused. "Has anyone talked to you about your pain level this morning?" The overnight nurse asked. "What did you tell her?" 7. "And now?" He thought about it. Still 7. Different kind of 7, though. She nodded slowly. "Different how?" "Tighter," he said, "like something's pulling." She checked his dressing, checked it again. The surgical site looked clean, but his abdomen was subtly rigid in a way that shouldn't have been there at 20 hours post-op, and his pressure, when she recalculated both readings, showed a variance that was small enough to miss if you were busy and just large enough to mean something if you weren't. She went back to the nursing station and pulled his pre-op labs alongside the overnight records. Dr. Marcus Kellerman arrived at 7:22 a.m. for rounds. A tall, unhurried man with a resident trailing him like a shadow, and Claire caught him at the edge of Bay 4. "Mr. Villanueva in Bay 4, she said. "His pressure's been trending down since the 3 a.m. check. Small variance, but it's consistent. He's also reporting a change in the quality of his pain, and his abdomen is—" "He's post-op," Kellerman said, not unkindly but without stopping walking. "Some variance is expected." "The trend is directional," she said. He paused, looked at her badge. "Float staff?" "Yes." "First day?" "Yes." He looked at her for a moment, then at the chart she was holding out. He took it, glanced at the numbers, and handed it back. "I'll check on him during rounds. If anything changes significantly, flag Donna." "Of course," she said. She went back to Mr. Villanueva and stayed close. The thing about Ironwood that nobody mentioned in the hiring packet was that it ran on a very specific social architecture. At the top was Dr. Richard Holloway, Chief of Surgical Services, board certified in 3 specialties, the kind of man whose name appeared on research papers and fundraising plaques in equal measure. He was 51, silver-haired, and moved through the hospital with the unhurried confidence of someone who had never once been asked to wait. Claire didn't encounter him until 9:15 a.m., and by then the morning had already begun to turn. She had been pulled from Bay 4, Mr. Villanueva stable for now, Kellerman having ordered additional monitoring, and reassigned to the surgical prep area to assist with a pre-procedure patient. She was reviewing the pre-op checklist when she overheard Holloway at the nursing station, reviewing imaging with 2 residents. She wasn't trying to listen, but the film he was holding up to the light box was positioned directly in her sightline, and she saw the scan before she understood what she was seeing, and then she understood, and then she had a problem. The patient, she could see the file number, not the name, had been flagged for a bowel resection based on imaging that showed a mass in the lower right quadrant. Holloway was describing the surgical approach with the easy authority of someone who had done the procedure 200 times. But the mass on that scan wasn't sitting where he was describing. The angle of the image, she could see it clearly from where she stood, had been misread. What he was pointing to as the target site was not where the mass was, and the approach he was planning would miss it. She stood very still for a moment, then she walked to the nursing station. "Excuse me," she said. She kept her voice level. "Dr. Holloway."
What?
He looked at her the way people look at someone who has spoken out of turn at a dinner party. Surprised, mildly annoyed, waiting for the interruption to end. "I'm sorry to interrupt," she said. "I may be wrong, but I think there might be an issue with the imaging orientation on that scan. The mass looks like it's posterior to where—" "Who are you?" he said. "Claire Bennett. I'm float staff. I'm sorry. I know this isn't my place." "You're right," he said. "It isn't." The 2 residents looked at the floor. "I understand," she said, "but if I could just show you what I'm seeing—" "What you're seeing," Holloway said, and his voice had shifted into something quieter and sharper, "is a scan that has been reviewed by 3 attending physicians and 2 radiologists. What you're seeing is a procedure that I have performed more times than you have been a nurse." He set the film down with a precise, controlled motion. "Where did you train?" "Mercy General. Before that I was—" "Float staff," he said. "First day." He turned back to the residents. "This is actually a useful teaching moment. In any high-functioning surgical unit, the chain of clinical authority exists for a reason. When someone without the relevant experience or credentials interrupts a senior physician mid-consult to offer an unsolicited second opinion, what that tells us is—" "Dr. Holloway." Her voice was still quiet. It didn't shake. "I'm asking you to look at the lateral view. That's all." The nursing station had gone completely silent. Donna had appeared from somewhere. 3 nurses stood frozen at their stations. The residents had found something very interesting to study on the wall behind Holloway's left shoulder. Holloway looked at her for a long moment. "Donna," he said. "Yes, Dr. Holloway." "Please remind float staff of the terms of their assignment here." Donna's face did something complicated. "Doctor Holloway, if there's a question about imaging, this isn't a question about imaging. This is a question about professional conduct." He picked the film back up. Turn in your badge. You're done here. The words landed in the room like something thrown. Claire stood still for 3 full seconds. Then she unclipped the badge from her scrubs and set it on the nursing station counter. She didn't slam it. She didn't say anything. She walked to the staff locker room, collected her bag, and left the building through the side exit so she wouldn't have to walk past the nursing station again. Nobody followed her. The morning air outside was gray and damp, the kind of October cold that gets into your collar, and she stood on the sidewalk outside the hospital's east wing for a moment without moving. Her hands were not shaking. She made sure of that first. She pressed her fingers flat against her thighs and felt them, steady, and then she breathed out slowly. She'd been fired before. Not like this, but she'd had bad days before. She started walking toward the parking structure. Inside the hospital, Mr. Villanueva in Bay 4 was deteriorating. It happened fast. Kellerman had moved on to other patients. The nurse covering the bay caught the pressure drop at 9:40 and called it in. By 9:50, there were 3 people in the bay, and someone was on the phone with surgery. Claire was in her car with the engine running, trying to decide whether to go home or drive somewhere and sit in a parking lot for a while when her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Unknown number. She let it ring. It rang again. She answered. Ms. Bennett. A man's voice. Flat, efficient, the kind of voice that had learned a long time ago not to waste words. My name is Colonel James Rourke. I'm looking for a woman matching your description who left Ironwood Veterans Medical Center approximately 30 minutes ago. Am I speaking with Claire Bennett? She looked at the hospital entrance through her windshield. Who gave you this number? Your Army file. I'm sorry there's no time to be more diplomatic about this. I have a 4-star general in the back of my convoy with a talk screen that's come back clean 3 times and a pulse ox that's been dropping for the last 40 minutes. I need someone who knows what compound V7 looks like on a clinical presentation. Your name came up. She was very quiet for a moment. Where are you? She said. Pulling into the hospital's east gate right now. She looked out the windshield again, and through the gray October morning, through the rain beginning to spot the glass, she saw the convoy. 3 black vehicles moving fast down the access road, no civilian plates, a soldier leaning out of the rear window of the lead truck. She put the car in park. I'll meet you at the bay doors, she said. She walked back through the side entrance without a badge, without a name tag, without anything except the knowledge that whatever was coming through those bay doors was going to be worse than anything Ironwood had handled in recent memory, and that there were probably 3 people in the building who would recognize what they were looking at. She was one of them. The other 2 were 1,500 miles away. The emergency bay was in controlled chaos when she pushed through the double doors. 2 of Holloway's residents were at the crash cart. A respiratory tech was fumbling with a ventilator connection. The triage nurse, a young man named Derek, she'd seen his badge during orientation, was on the phone reading off vitals with the careful, rapid precision of someone who had been trained for this but hadn't done it yet for real. And in the center of it, on the gurney, was a man who looked like he was dying in very specific and deliberate ways. General Howard Marsh. She recognized him. Not personally, but she knew the name, had seen it in briefings, knew what it meant in certain rooms and certain buildings. He was 67, broad-shouldered even now, and his color was wrong in the particular way she had seen twice before in places she was not supposed to talk about. Colonel Rourke was at her side the moment she pushed through. Bennett, he said. Not a greeting, an acknowledgement. How long since first symptoms? He complained of headache and nausea at 0800 during a briefing. By 0830, he couldn't stand. We had him in transit by 0845. Any emesis? Once. No blood. Tremor? Left hand. Started about 20 minutes ago. She moved to the gurney. She didn't ask anyone's permission. She checked his pupils. Unequal, left larger than right, but not blown. Then his nail beds. Then she pressed 2 fingers to his wrist and held them there longer than a standard pulse check. What's his temp? 98. 2, Derek said from the phone, then looked at her. Who are you? Has anyone given him activated charcoal? We were about to... Don't. She said it with the particular calm of someone who is not being dramatic. Not until we know what we're treating. Charcoal won't do anything for this, and it'll make the next hour significantly harder. She stood up. I need someone to call pharmacy and ask them about their current stock of atropine glycopyrrolate compound, not atropine alone. The compound. Derek looked at Rourke. Rourke looked at Derek. Do what she says. The residents had stopped moving. The one closest to the crash cart, a young woman with her hair escaping its braid, was staring at Claire with the expression of someone who was trying to place a face. And then the bay doors opened again. Dr. Richard Holloway walked in with Donna Reyes half a step behind him, and he stopped when he saw Claire standing at the head of the gurney. The silence in the room was the kind that has weight to it. Holloway looked at Colonel Rourke, then at Claire, then at the badge she wasn't wearing. What, he said very carefully, is she doing in my ER? Your ER, Rourke said, is currently treating a 4-star general with a 20% chance of surviving the next 2 hours if someone figures out what's in his system. I'm told your specialists have been looking at clean talk screens and guessing. Ms. Bennett isn't guessing. Ms. Bennett, Holloway said, was terminated from this hospital 3 hours ago for, Colonel. Claire didn't look at Holloway. She was still watching the general's face, the micro-tremor in his jaw, the way his eyes tracked when the light shifted. I need the pharmacy call now, and I need everyone who isn't directly involved in treatment to clear this bay. Now wait a minute, Holloway said. Doctor. Rourke's voice had gone very flat. With respect, stand down. Holloway turned to look at the colonel with the expression of a man who had not been spoken to that way in a long time. He opened his mouth. The general's pressure just dropped again, Derek said from the monitor. 74/40. The room moved. Even Holloway moved. Physician reflex, years of training, the body responding before the ego could intervene. He went to the cart. His residents went to their positions. And Claire stood at the head of the gurney, and she looked at General Howard Marsh's face, and she said quietly, almost to herself, There you are. Because she knew what this was now. She'd known it since the colonel said left-hand tremor and clean talk screen in the same sentence. The problem wasn't that the standard tests had come back negative. The problem was that they were the wrong tests. What was in this man's system wasn't on any standard panel because it had been engineered specifically to avoid standard panels. She'd seen the documentation on it in a briefing that had a classification level she was not going to mention in this room. She'd seen 2 people treated for it. One had made it, one hadn't. And the difference between those 2 outcomes came down to a 40-minute window and whether someone in the room knew what they were actually fighting. She looked up at the clock on the bay wall. They had maybe 90 minutes, possibly less. Holloway was at the crash cart giving orders in the precise, authoritative cadence of a man who was very good at medicine and completely wrong about the situation, and his residents were following his lead, and the monitor was still showing a pressure that was moving in exactly the wrong direction, and nobody in this room except Claire knew why. She picked up the nearest chart and began writing. Derek appeared at her elbow. Pharmacy's on hold, they want to know what strength. Tell them I'll call back in 4 minutes. She kept writing. And I need someone to find me the attending toxicologist. Not the on-call fellow. The attending. Dr. Reyes. Dr. Priya Reyes, not Donna. She's upstairs, but she's in the middle of... Get her, Claire said. Holloway looked over from the cart. Nobody is going upstairs. We have a protocol. Your protocol, Claire said, and she finally looked at him directly, was designed for things that show up on a talk screen. This doesn't. And if you keep following it, you will watch this man die in a very orderly and evidence-based fashion. She set the chart down. I'm not trying to take over your ER. I'm trying to tell you that you are looking at the wrong problem. The young resident with the escaping braid, her name badge said Novak K., was watching Claire with an expression that had shifted from confusion to something else. Not belief exactly, but attention. What is the right problem? Novak asked. Everyone in the room looked at her like she'd said something strange. That's the first useful question anyone has asked, Claire said. She pulled the chart back. Give me 4 minutes, and I'll show you. Outside, the October rain had started in earnest. It came down against the bay windows in waves, and the light in the room had taken on that particular gray quality that makes everything feel slightly unreal, slightly held in suspension. The monitors beeped, the ventilator hissed. Rourke stood near the door with his arms at his sides and said nothing. And Claire Bennett, who had no badge, no credentials on this particular wall, no title in this building, stood at the gurney of a dying man and began reconstructing, from memory, a treatment protocol she had last seen written on a classified document in a tent in a country that most people in this room had never been to. The general's left hand trembled against the mattress. His pressure hit 68/35, and Dr. Holloway, for the first time since she'd met him, went very quiet. 4 minutes was an optimistic estimate, and she knew it when she said it, but it bought her the room's attention, which was the only resource she actually needed right now. She wrote fast, not sloppily. She'd learned years ago that messy handwriting in a clinical emergency creates a second layer of crisis, but with the compressed efficiency of someone transcribing from memory rather than reasoning through uncertainty. The protocol she was reconstructing wasn't something she'd reviewed recently. It lived in a part of her brain that she kept very deliberately quiet, behind everything she'd built over the past 3 years to look like an ordinary person with an ordinary nursing license and an ordinary apartment and an ordinary life that required no further explanation. That compartment was open now. She wasn't happy about it. Cholinergic pathway inhibition, she said, still writing. The tremor is muscarinic, not Parkinsonian. The pressure drop isn't cardiac in origin. His rhythm's sinus, look at the strip. It's vasodilatory. Whatever's in his system is blocking acetylcholinesterase at the peripheral level while simultaneously triggering a central sedation cascade. She tore the top sheet off the chart and held it out. That's why the tox screen is clean. This compound was synthesized to present as a cardiac event until the patients passed the intervention window. Nobody moved for a moment. Then Novak crossed the room and took the paper. Holloway watched her do it. His face had done something complicated, the initial flash of anger collapsing into something more like unwilling attention, which was probably the closest thing to open-mindedness he'd managed in the last decade. He looked at the strip on the monitor, looked at the general's color, looked at Claire. "You're describing a nerve agent," he said, "a synthetic analog. Not the same delivery mechanism, different molecular structure, but the clinical effect is similar enough that the treatment overlaps." She capped the pen. "The key difference is that standard atropine dosing won't be enough. You need the glycopyrrolate compound because it crosses the blood-brain barrier differently. Without it, you'll stabilize his heart rate, and he'll still herniate." The room was very quiet except for the monitors and the rain. "How do you know this?" Holloway said. She looked at him directly. "Because I've treated it." "Where?" She held his gaze for exactly the amount of time it took him to understand that she wasn't going to answer that question, and then she turned back to the chart. Rourke was already on his phone, one hand pressed against his other ear to block the room noise. She caught fragments. "Pentagon, authorization code. Yes, she's here. She's already on it." And then he stepped out of the bay into the corridor, and she let him go because she didn't need his confirmation. She knew what she'd seen. She knew what this was. What she needed was pharmacy. "Derek," she said, right here." "Did you reach them?" "On hold. Dr. Reyes, Priya Reyes." Her fellow called back. "She's coming down. Tell pharmacy we need glycopyrrolate, 2 milligrams, and I need to know if they have pralidoxime on the shelf, or if we're ordering emergency supply. If it's emergency supply, that's a problem, and I need to know now." Derek was already typing. "What's pralidoxime for?" "If the glycopyrrolate doesn't reactivate the enzyme pathway fast enough, we need a second line." She paused. "It's a long shot, but I want it available." "That's an antidote for organophosphate poisoning," Holloway said from behind her. He said it not like an objection, but like a man reluctantly following a logical thread. "We don't have confirmed organophosphate exposure." "We don't have confirmed anything," she said. "But the clinical presentation fits better than any cardiac etiology, and we're running out of time to be right in the conventional sense." He didn't answer immediately. She heard him move. Footsteps, the squeak of a shoe on the bay floor. And then he was standing next to her at the monitor, looking at the waveform with his arms crossed and his reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, and he looked, for the first time since she'd met him, like a physician instead of a performance. "His pupils are unequal," Holloway said. I attributed it to early herniation. It's not herniation. It's the asymmetric muscarinic blockade. The left eye is more affected because the compound was administered, I'm guessing here, but it fits, on his left side. Skin absorption, not ingestion. Check his left forearm. Holloway looked at her. Then he walked to the gurney and rolled up the general's left sleeve. The skin on the inner forearm was slightly reddened, not dramatically, nothing you'd catch on a cursory exam. A faint flush, approximately 3 centimeters in diameter, centered below the elbow. Son of a... Holloway stopped himself. He bent closer. Novak was at his elbow immediately with a penlight. Contact exposure, Claire said. Probably within the last 4 hours, something he touched or something that touched him. Handshake, door handle, paperwork, briefing materials. The compound absorbs transdermally and hits the bloodstream slowly enough that by the time symptoms present, the source is long gone. He had a morning briefing, Rourke said from the doorway. He'd come back in without her noticing. 12 people in the room. We've already pulled security footage. Good. She turned to face him. I need you to think about who in that briefing room handed him something. A pen, a folder, a glass of water. Anyone who made physical contact with him. Rourke's expression shifted very slightly. It wasn't surprise exactly. It was the look of someone who had just had a suspicion confirmed. I have a list of names. Hold on to it. We'll come back to that. She turned back to the monitors. Right now I need the general to still be alive in 90 minutes. The glycopyrrolate was in the pharmacy. That was the first piece of good news. The pralidoxime was a different story. Ironwood stocked a small supply for agricultural exposure cases, 3 doses. And when Derek relayed the number, Claire did the math in her head and determined it was probably enough, and didn't say the word probably out loud because this room didn't need that. Dr. Priya Reyes arrived 9 minutes later, not running but moving at the specific brisk walk of someone who has trained herself not to run in hospital corridors because running scares the patients. She was younger than Claire expected, mid-40s, with close-cropped gray hair and the focused expression of someone who had already been briefed on the basics and was here to fill in the rest. She stopped at the bay entrance and looked at the scene. General on the gurney, Rourke in the corner, Holloway at the crash cart, Claire with a chart. And then she looked at Claire specifically and said, "You're the one who diagnosed V7? I suggested the mechanism. I haven't confirmed the compound." Nobody can confirm it with a standard panel, Reyes said, moving to the gurney. I've read 3 case reports, and 2 of them were classified until 18 months ago. She checked the general's pupils herself, quick and methodical. You said glycopyrrolate. 2 milligrams to start. I'd like to have another dose ready. Reyes straightened up. What's your basis for the dosing? Field protocol. There were 2 exposures, one in theater, one in a transit facility. The second patient, who survived, responded to 2 milligrams with a follow-up dose at 40 minutes. Reyes looked at her for a moment. Not skeptically. More like she was taking a measurement. You were there? I was there. Reyes nodded once. Okay. She turned to Holloway. Richard, I need you to tell pharmacy to release the compound. It needs to go through you. Holloway had been quiet for the past several minutes, which was unusual enough that the residents had both started glancing at him periodically, checking for signs of life. He was looking at the faint redness on the general's forearm, which someone had circled with a marker at Claire's direction. He looked up when Reyes said his name. I'll call them, he said. His voice was careful, stripped of its usual register. He walked out of the bay. Novak let out a breath that she'd probably been holding for 10 minutes. The first dose went in at 10:47 a.m. The next 20 minutes were the kind that don't move in a straight line. They accumulate in irregular pulses, each monitor alarm a small cardiac event for everyone in the room, each minute of stable readings a reprieve that nobody trusted yet. Claire stood at the foot of the gurney and watched the general's face with the focused stillness of someone who has learned to read vital signs in people who can't speak, who has sat beside patients in conditions where no one else was coming, and the only data available was whatever she could observe with her own eyes and hands. His pressure at 10:52, 69/38, still dropping. At 10:55, 71/40, holding. At 10:58, 74/42. Trending up, Derek said, with the restrained relief of someone who didn't want to jinx it. Slowly, Claire said. Keep the second dose ready. Reyes was at the lab terminal running a modified panel, not the standard tox screen, but a research-tier immunoassay that she'd called in a favor to get processed. It wouldn't confirm V7 specifically, but it would show enzyme activity suppression consistent with the mechanism Claire had described. It wouldn't be back for another 40 minutes. By then, they'd know one way or the other whether the treatment was working. Claire didn't need the lab to tell her it was working. She could see it in the color returning to the general's jaw and neck, the tremor in his left hand slowing from a continuous movement to an intermittent one. It was working. It was just working slowly, which was accurate to the case reports and terrifying to watch in real time. Holloway came back in at 11:03. He stood near the door for a moment, watching the monitors, then walked to the gurney and checked the general's pupils with his own penlight without asking anyone's permission. Then he checked them again. Both 4 millimeters, he said. They were 5 and 3 when he came in. Equalizing, Reyes said from the terminal without turning around. Consistent with the muscarinic blockade reversing. Holloway capped the penlight. He turned to look at Claire. She expected something. Another challenge. Another question about credentials, something to reestablish the hierarchy that her presence was obviously disrupting. Instead, he just looked at her for a moment with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. "What else do you need?" he said. It was such a simple question that it took her a second to process it as genuine. "I'd like to talk to whoever's been with the general since 0800, she said. "His security detail, the people who were in the briefing room." "That's a military matter," Rourke said. "It's a medical matter until we know he's out of danger." She glanced at Rourke. "Whoever administered this compound is probably still in contact range. If they know the treatment window has passed, they may attempt a second exposure." The room went quiet in a different way than it had before. Rourke straightened. "What makes you think they'd try again?" "Because one exposure at this dose level was always going to be insufficient," she said. "V7 analogs work by accumulation. The first dose gets the patient into a clinical crisis. The second dose, if administered within a 6 to 8 hour window, pushes past the threshold. The first exposure wasn't meant to kill him in the ER. It was meant to get him into the ER. Nobody moved. "Whoever did this," she continued, "wanted him isolated from his normal environment, his normal security, surrounded by people who don't know what they're looking at, in a facility where access can be managed." She looked around the bay. "They wanted him here." What happened next happened fast, and then slow, and then fast again in the way that crises do when they stop being theoretical. Rourke stepped into the corridor and made 3 phone calls in 12 minutes. Claire could hear his voice through the bay window. Not the words, just the cadence, the clipped back and forth of military communication, questions and answers compressed to their essential information. When he came back in, his face had changed. "2 members of the security detail didn't make it to the convoy," he said. "What do you mean didn't make it?" Holloway said. "I mean, they're not here. They were assigned to escort the general to this facility, and they're not in any of the vehicles." Rourke's jaw was tight. "One of them called in a mechanical issue. The other one, Sergeant Dale Purcell, hasn't checked in since 0920. Claire filed the name without reacting. "How many detail members do you have in the building right now?" she said. 6. 2 on the bay entrance, 2 at the building perimeter, 2 in here. He indicated the soldiers she'd been peripherally aware of since they came in, positioned near the bay door, weapons holstered but hands ready. "I need you to watch your 6 for behavioral signs," she said quietly. "Not threats. Just watch for someone whose concern for the general seems slightly off. Too much, too little, any deviation from what you'd expect." Rourke looked at her. "You think the second exposure is already in this building. I think the first exposure was designed to put the general in a controlled environment with limited access, which means either the second attempt gets made here or the plan collapses." She held his gaze. "So yes, I think someone in or near this building is waiting." "I have 6 men I've worked with for 18 months, Rourke said. "I know." He didn't say anything for a moment. "Then, how do we proceed?" "We keep the general stable, we keep the treatment going, and we act like we don't know." She glanced at the monitors. If whoever is waiting thinks the general is still in critical condition, they'll wait. If they think he's recovering, they'll move. You want to control what they see. I want to control what they think they see. There's a difference." Rourke was quiet for a moment. Then he gave her a very slight nod that meant something, though she wasn't entirely sure what yet. The lab results came back at 11:41 a.m. Priya Reyes printed them and read them standing at the terminal, and then she read them again. And then she walked across the bay and held them out to Claire without saying anything because the numbers said it clearly enough. Acetylcholinesterase activity suppressed to 11% of baseline. The normal range was 70 to 130. 11% was consistent with severe organophosphate class exposure. It was also, notably, completely invisible on a standard toxicology screen because of the molecular structure of the synthetic compound that caused it. Claire looked at the printout for a moment. Then she handed it to Reyes. "Second dose," she said. "And then we need to talk about the next 4 hours." Holloway had been reading over Reyes's shoulder. He took the paper when Reyes was done with it and stood holding it with the look of someone rearranging a significant number of things in their understanding of the last 3 hours. "This is a classified agent," he said. "The lab result doesn't know that," Claire said. "But you knew it before the lab result." She looked at him. "Yes." "Which means you have a classification level." "Which means," she said carefully, "that I'm standing in your emergency bay trying to keep a patient alive, and anything else about me is irrelevant to that goal." Holloway held the paper for another moment. Then he set it down on the cart. "I'd like you to stay," he said. It came out flat, like a sentence that had cost him something to form. "For the duration of the general's treatment, whatever that requires." She almost said something about the badge on the nursing station counter. She didn't. "Fine," she said. The second dose went in at 11:49. Quotab. At 12:15, General Marsh's blood pressure was 91/62, and his left hand had stopped trembling. At 12:30, he opened his eyes. Not fully, a half-open, glassy look, the eyes of someone climbing back from a long distance, but open, present. His gaze moved across the ceiling and then found Rourke standing at the foot of the gurney, and something in his face shifted. "Colonel," he said. His voice was barely there, like speech was something he was borrowing rather than owning. "Sir." Rourke moved closer. "You're at Ironwood Veterans Medical Center. You're stable." The general's eyes moved to Claire. He looked at her for a moment with the particular directness of someone who has learned to notice things even under compromised conditions. "Who are you?" he said. "Nobody important," she said. "How's your left hand?" He looked at it, flexed the fingers slowly. "Weak. That'll pass. Try not to use it for about an hour." She made a note. "Do you remember the morning briefing?" His eyes sharpened slightly. "Yes." "Don't tell me what happened in it, just, do you remember feeling anything unusual, a handshake, something you touched, anyone who was closer to you than they should have been?" The general was quiet for a moment. The machines beeped. Rain moved against the window in a slow wave. "There was a folder," he said. Rourke went very still. "On the table when I arrived. Someone said it was the morning brief materials." The general's brow furrowed. "I picked it up before anyone else was in the room. Do you know who put it there?" "No." He paused. "I assumed it was staff." Claire looked at Rourke. Rourke looked back at her. "I need that room secured," she said. "Don't touch the folder. Don't touch the table. Anyone who was in that room this morning needs to be evaluated for dermal exposure, even if they're asymptomatic." "Already in motion," Rourke said. He was on his phone again before the sentence was finished. The general was watching her with the same focused attention that she'd noticed when he first opened his eyes. He was the kind of man who collected information the way other people collected objects, carefully, with an eye toward what each piece might eventually be worth. "You know what this is," he said. Not a question. "I know what this looks like," she said. "And what does it look like?" She met his eyes. "Like someone knew your schedule and had access to your briefing room and understood exactly how much exposure it would take to put you in an ER without killing you on the spot." She paused. "That's not a random attack. That's a plan." He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved behind his eyes. Not fear, more like recognition. like a man who has been expecting a particular kind of weather and has now watched it arrive. "Yes," he said, "it is." By 1 p.m., the ICU had become something other than a hospital floor. 2 additional soldiers had arrived and posted outside the double doors. A federal liaison, a woman in a gray suit named Paulson, who introduced herself only by last name, had appeared from somewhere and was now in the glass-walled consultation room with Rourke and 2 laptops, and the door was closed and the blinds were pulled. Donna Reyes, the charge nurse, not the toxicologist, had quietly rerouted 3 elective patients to the step-down unit and was managing the floor with the contained efficiency of someone who had decided not to ask questions because the answers would probably make her shift harder. Holloway had not left the ICU. Claire noticed this. He'd had reasons to go. Other patients, other responsibilities, a full surgical schedule that had presumably been upended by the events of the morning, but he stayed. He moved around the periphery of things, checking on the general intermittently, reviewing notes, talking to Novak in the low voice of someone walking a resident through a case they'll remember for the rest of their career. But he stayed. At 1:20, he appeared at Claire's elbow while she was updating the treatment log. "The bowel resection," he said. She kept writing. "What about it?" "The imaging." He paused. "I went back and looked at the lateral view." She set the pen down. "You were right," he said. He said it with the difficulty of a man pulling something out of himself that doesn't come out easily. "The mass is posterior. The approach I was planning would have missed it." She turned to look at him. His face was what it was. Not contrite exactly, but honest, which was probably as close to contrite as a man like him was going to get on short acquaintance. "The procedure's been rescheduled," he said. "Corrected approach." She nodded. "Good. That patient would have come through surgery and woken up with the mass still in place," she said. "And then it would have been a second surgery to fix the first one. And that's if everything else went well." He was quiet for a moment. "Yes." She picked up the pen again. "How's Mr. Villanueva in Bay 4? Whatever he'd been expecting her to say, that wasn't it. He blinked. "The hernia repair?" "His pressure was trending down this morning. I flagged it before—" She stopped. "Before I left. Kellerman caught it at 10 a.m., small hematoma at the surgical site. They went back in and addressed it." He paused. "He's fine." She let out a breath. "Okay." Holloway looked at her for a moment, and she got the sense he wanted to say something else, but whatever it was didn't make it out. He went back to reviewing charts. Vas. At 2:15 p.m., the general asked to sit up. It wasn't medically advised, and Claire said so, and he ignored her, which was consistent with what she'd observed about him in the last 3 hours. She adjusted the bed angle to 30 degrees as a compromise, and he accepted it with the expression of a man who had learned to pick his battles. "I want to talk to my detail," he said. "Colonel Rourke has restricted access," Claire said. "I'm aware. I'm also a 4-star general." "You're a 4-star general who was poisoned this morning and is currently on a treatment protocol for a classified synthetic compound. Your judgment about access restrictions can wait until your acetylcholinesterase activity is back above 50%. He looked at her with the particular expression of a powerful man being firmly managed by someone who is not impressed by his power, and then something shifted in his face that might have been amusement if it had been given more room. "What's your name?" he said. "I told you. Nobody important." "You told me nobody important," he said. "That's not a name." "Bennett," she said. "Claire Bennett." He was quiet for a moment. "Bennett." He said it like he was checking something. "Did we serve together?" "No, sir." "But you've been in theater." She didn't answer. "The V7 protocol," he said. "That's not field medicine. That's classified special operations medical training, the kind that goes to personnel with a certain profile." He watched her. "Where did you serve?" She looked at him steadily. "Where do you need me to say you heard it from?" His eyes moved over her face. "You're protecting a classification." "I'm trying to keep you alive, sir. The classification is a secondary concern." "What's the primary concern?" She glanced toward the corridor, where one of the 6 soldiers was visible through the bay window, standing with his weight shifted slightly to the left, his attention ostensibly on the double doors but his eyes moving in a pattern that didn't quite match his posture. She'd been watching him for 40 minutes. She looked back at the general and kept her voice very even. "Right now, my primary concern is that someone in your security detail is still in this building, and I'd like to figure out which one before visiting hours end." The general's face did not change, but his eyes did. They went quiet and sharp in the way of someone dropping a non-essential layer. "Tell me what you see," he said. She looked at the corridor again. The soldier, third from the left, broad-shouldered, specialist rank insignia, name tape she couldn't read at this distance, shifted his weight again. "Your detail has been on their feet for 6 hours in a high-stress environment," she said. "Most of them are showing it. Tension in the shoulders, occasional eye movement to the exits, the micro-adjustments that come from fatigue." She paused. "The one nearest the far door isn't fatigued. He's waiting." "Waiting for what?" "That," she said quietly, "is what worries me." She picked up her pen and wrote a number on the corner of the treatment log, the specific dose timing for the next monitoring check, and then tore the corner off and folded it once. But she didn't hand it to anyone. She held it, because the soldier near the door had just checked his watch for the second time in 12 minutes, and his hand, when it came back to his side, was slightly closer to his hip than it had been before. And at that same moment, Paulson opened the door of the consultation room and walked across the ICU floor toward the bay, and the expression on her face had the controlled flatness of someone carrying bad news they haven't decided how to deliver yet. She stopped at the bay entrance. "Colonel Rourke needs both of you," she said. She looked at the general, then at Claire. "We found the folder." "And?" Rourke said from behind her. He'd followed her out. Paulson looked at Claire. "The forensics team identified a secondary contact point, not the folder itself." She paused. "The pen that was clipped to it, custom made, designed to release on pressure contact. Everyone in the room processed that." "Fingerprints?" Claire said. "Wiped clean, but there was a partial print on the clip mechanism. Enough for a comparison." Paulson's voice didn't change. "It matched someone in the building." Rourke looked at his 6 soldiers. The soldier near the far door, the one who had been checking his watch, the one with the wrong weight distribution, the one whose concern hadn't looked like concern, turned his head very slightly toward the bay, as if he'd caught a sound or a change in the room's energy that he hadn't expected. And Claire looked at Rourke, and Rourke looked at her, and in the space of that half-second, something was decided that neither of them said out loud. The soldier's hand moved toward his hip. The soldier's name was Corporal Brett Okafor, and he was 26 years old, and he made his decision in the same half-second that Claire made hers. His hand reached his hip. Claire was already moving, not toward him, which would have been wrong, but sideways, putting herself between the bay entrance and the general's gurney in the single motion of someone who has done this in non-hypothetical conditions. She didn't shout. She didn't reach for anything because she had nothing to reach for. What she did was plant her feet and face the door and make herself a problem that would have to be solved before anything else could happen. Rourke was faster. He covered the distance from the consultation room doorway to Okafor in 4 steps, and had the corporal's weapon arm twisted up behind his back before Okafor had cleared the holster. Not clean. Okafor got half a rotation in before Rourke locked him, and there was a grunt of effort from both of them and the sound of a shoulder joint under serious stress, but contained. The second soldier at the door was there in the next instant, and then the 2 at the building perimeter were through the double doors, and Okafor went down to the floor with 3 men on him and his face against the tile and his weapon skidding across the ICU floor toward the nursing station. The whole thing took 11 seconds. Donna Reyes was on the phone to security before the weapon stopped moving. Novak had her back against the far wall with both hands up, like she wasn't sure what the protocol was and didn't want to guess wrong. Derek had somehow ended up in the doorway of Bay 4 with a crash cart between him and the corridor, which was either tactical instinct or coincidence, but either way, it wasn't bad. Holloway was standing in the middle of the ICU floor with his hands at his sides and an expression that Claire had not seen on his face before. Not fear, not authority, just the raw look of a man watching something happen that none of his training had prepared him for. Claire turned back to the general. He was sitting at 30 degrees with his hands flat on the mattress and his eyes on the corridor, and his face had the particular quality of someone who has been in rooms where things go wrong and has learned to stay very still when they do. You're okay, she said. I know, he said. He meant it. She checked his monitors anyway. Pressure held at 94/64. Pulse elevated, understandably, but rhythmically stable. She adjusted the IV rate slightly and made a note and kept her hands from shaking through an act of will that she would not think about until much later. Okafor, the general said quietly. Yes, sir? He closed his eyes for a moment. Just a moment. How long? I don't know, she said. That's not my question to answer. He opened his eyes. No, he said. I suppose it isn't. What followed was the strange, compressed bureaucracy of a crisis resolving into a crime scene. Paulson took over the corridor. Federal credentials produced from inside her gray jacket, a phone call that visibly changed the energy of everyone who overheard it, and within 20 minutes there were people in the building who had not been there before. Not soldiers, not hospital staff, something in between, with the quiet efficiency of people who arrive after things have gone wrong and whose job it is to make sure they understand exactly how wrong. Okafor was removed from the ICU floor. He did not speak. He stared at a point somewhere in the middle distance and let them move him, and his face had the closed, deliberate blankness of someone who had made a decision a long time ago and had known this was one of the possible outcomes. Rourke stood in the corridor for a long time after, not moving. His right hand was opening and closing slowly at his side in a way she didn't think he knew he was doing. She found him there at 2:50 p.m. 18 months, he said, without turning around. I know. He was good. He was... Rourke stopped. I recommended him for this detail personally. She stood next to him and didn't say anything for a moment because there wasn't anything useful to say, and she'd learned a long time ago that the impulse to fill that kind of silence was about the listener's discomfort, not the speaker's need. The pen mechanism was custom, she said finally. That's not something a corporal builds. Someone built it for him. Someone with access to the compound, access to the general's schedule, and enough operational knowledge to design a two-stage exposure. Okafor was a delivery mechanism. There's a network behind this. Rourke turned to look at her. Paulson's team is already pulling his communications. Good. She's also asking about you. Claire looked at the wall. Not in a threatening way, Rourke said. More like she wants to know who she's working with. She's working with a float nurse who had a bad first day, Claire said. That's all she needs. Rourke was quiet for a moment. You know that's not going to hold. I know, she exhaled. Give me a few more hours with it. He looked at her with the expression of a man who understood compartmentalization professionally and personally, and nodded once. But the general's enzyme activity came back at 320, 38%, up from 11. Not where they needed it, but the trajectory was clear and positive, and Priya Reyes looked at the number and said, okay, in the particular way that means we're going to be all right without anyone having to say it in those words. Claire was updating the monitoring log when Novak appeared beside her. The resident had been quiet since the takedown, processing, probably, doing the thing young physicians do when reality exceeds the curriculum. But now she had that look again, the one from earlier, not skepticism, attention. Can I ask you something? Novak said. You can try. The glycopyrrolate dosing, the protocol you reconstructed. She hesitated. I looked it up. There's no published literature. Not for that compound at that presentation. I searched 3 databases. No, Claire said. There isn't. So how did you? I was there when the protocol was developed, Claire said. I was part of it. Novak absorbed that. Where? Claire looked at her. The resident was 28, maybe 29, with dark circles under her eyes from what looked like a longer stretch of call than anyone should do, and the particular intensity of someone who came into medicine because they genuinely wanted to understand things. She reminded Claire in a way that was uncomfortable of herself at that age. Somewhere that I can't tell you about, Claire said, but the reasoning is replicable. The mechanism is cholinergic pathway inhibition. The treatment logic follows from basic pharmacology. You just need to know what you're inhibiting and why the standard intervention is insufficient. If you work backward from the clinical presentation to the mechanism, you get to the same place. Novak was quiet for a moment. I didn't work backward. I didn't even know what I was looking at. You asked the right question, Claire said. When everyone else was doing what they were told, you asked what the actual problem was. That's the thing that matters. Novak looked at her for a moment. Dr. Holloway was going to give the patient charcoal. I know. That would have made the next hour significantly harder. Yes. Claire looked back at her log. It wouldn't have killed him on its own, but it would have delayed the real treatment, and we were already close to the window. Close? How close? 20 minutes, Claire said. Maybe less. Novak was quiet then. He was going to let you walk out of here this morning. He did let me walk out. And then something more important happened, Claire said. She set the pen down. Dr. Holloway is a skilled surgeon. He made an imaging error, and he made a professional judgment error. And then he made a correct decision about the bowel resection when he had better information, and then he stayed in this unit all day when he could have left. She paused. People are more than their worst moment. Mostly. Novak seemed to be turning that over. Are you going to come back to Ironwood? Claire hadn't thought about it. She'd been too busy thinking about the next 15 minutes, which was a habit that ran very deep. I don't know yet, she said. At 4:05 p.m., the general's pressure hit 102/68. Priya Reyes ordered a third enzyme panel and stood at the terminal with her arms crossed and her reading glasses on, and the particular focused quiet of a physician who is watching a patient come back. The numbers were moving. Slowly, unevenly. There was a dip at 3:45 that had made everyone in the bay hold very still for about 6 minutes, but moving. Claire had been awake since 5:30 a.m. She could feel it now, in the specific way that exhaustion presents when adrenaline starts to metabolize, a heaviness behind the eyes, a slight delay in her own thinking that she was monitoring the way she'd monitor a patient's vitals. Not dangerous yet, but there. She was sitting in the chair beside the general's gurney, reviewing the monitoring log when he spoke. "You've been watching the door," he said. She looked up. He was more alert than he'd been an hour ago, the eyes clearer, the voice carrying more weight. "I've been watching the monitors," she said. "And the door." She conceded that with a slight tilt of her head. "Is it over?" he asked. "The immediate threat is contained," she said. "The investigation is active. Whether it's over depends on what Paulson's team finds in Okafor's communications and whether there are additional exposure vectors we haven't identified." "And in your assessment?" She looked at the door, then at him. "In my assessment, the plan required Okafor to succeed today. He didn't. That means someone at the top of this network is either cutting their losses or making a new plan. Either way, there's a window right now where they're reactive rather than proactive." She paused. "That's the safest you're going to be for the next 72 hours. The general was quiet for a moment. "And after 72 hours? You'll have the full investigative apparatus of the federal government between you and whatever comes next." She looked back at the log. "You don't need me for that part." He looked at her for a long moment. "My aide is going to come in here in the next hour with a form," he said. "A commendation form. Standard procedure when a civilian renders material assistance in a federal security matter." He watched her face. "I expect you'll tell him you don't want it." "I expect I will," she said. "Why?" She thought about it honestly, which she didn't always bother to do with questions like this. "Because I didn't do it for a commendation. I did it because you were dying and I knew how to stop it. That's the definition of a commendable act." "Maybe." She turned a page in the log. "The commendation comes with paperwork. The paperwork creates a record. The record connects to other records." "Your classification." "Among other things." He nodded slowly. "The woman who doesn't exist." "Something like that." He was quiet for a moment. The monitors beeped. Outside the bay window, the ICU floor had returned to something resembling its normal rhythm. Donna at the nursing station, Derek doing med rounds, Novak writing notes at a terminal. The soldiers at the door were still there, but they'd relaxed incrementally, the posture of men who have resolved one threat and are now running on watchfulness rather than urgency. "I was in a briefing last spring," the general said. "A classified assessment of non-standard threats to senior defense personnel. The working group cited a gap. Specifically, the absence of field-tested protocols for synthetic compound exposures that evade standard detection. He looked at her. The working group recommended embedding personnel with relevant experience into veterans' medical facilities, personnel with classified backgrounds who could function as a quiet first responder layer. Claire stopped turning pages. That recommendation was approved, he said. The program was funded, rolled out quietly. No fanfare. She looked at him. The position at Ironwood, he said. Float staff. Posted 6 weeks ago. The room felt very still. I applied because I needed work, she said carefully. I know why you think you applied, he said. She set the log down. She looked at the general, at the composed intelligence of his face, at the way he was watching her with the patience of someone who has been managing information and people for a long time and has learned to let the moment do the work. Who approved the program, she said. He almost smiled. That would be telling. Who knew I was on the short list? Fewer people than you'd think. More than you'd like. She looked at the window, then at the door, then at Rourke, who was standing in the corridor with his back to the bay, talking to Paulson, and who had, she now recalled, gotten to the hospital's east gate in an implausibly short time for someone who had been tracking a convoy in transit. He already knew where I was, she said. When he called, he didn't look up my file after the general collapsed. He had my number ready. The convoy had 2 destinations, the general said quietly. The hospital was the official one. She turned to look at him. The second destination, he said, was wherever you were. The weight of it settled on her slowly, the way things do when they're large enough that the mind has to take them in pieces. She had walked out of this hospital this morning with her badge on the nursing station counter and her hands not shaking and the conviction that she had failed at the most ordinary possible version of her life. And the entire architecture of that failure had been, in some sense, designed. She wasn't sure yet whether she was angry. She looked at the general. You should have just called me, she said. Would you have come? She thought about it honestly, the apartment, the quiet, the careful, constructed ordinariness of the last 3 years. The decision, made a long time ago in a different country under very different circumstances, that she was done with the work. No, she said. I know, he said. That's why we didn't call. She stood up, walked to the window. The ICU floor moved below her in its ordinary rhythms, and outside the corridor in the gray afternoon light, the city continued doing what cities do when people inside buildings are having moments that will change the shape of things. Her hands were not shaking. She checked. What do you actually want from me? She said. What you did today, he said. On a more formal basis. She turned around. The program needs a clinical coordinator, someone who can work inside veterans' facilities, identify non-standard threats, and respond when the standard protocols fail. He watched her. The position doesn't officially exist. The paperwork looks like nursing administration. The salary is unremarkable. And when another poison general comes through the door, you'd know what to do. You've demonstrated that fairly conclusively. She looked at him for a long moment. Then her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out. Unknown number, but not the same one Rourke had called from. A different area code entirely. She stared at it. It buzzed again. Are you going to answer it? The general said. She looked at him, then at the phone, then at Rourke through the window, who had gone still in the corridor, his phone at his ear, his face turned slightly away from Paulson in the posture of someone receiving information he hadn't expected. He turned, found her through the glass. His expression told her exactly nothing, which was the most alarming thing he could have communicated. She answered the phone. Ms. Bennett? A different voice this time, older, and carrying the specific weight of institutional authority that didn't need to announce itself. I understand you've had quite a day. Who is this? She said. Someone who has been watching the situation at Ironwood with considerable interest. A pause. I'm also someone who can tell you that Corporal Okafor is not the end of this. The network your colleague is currently investigating has a domestic arm that we've been tracking for 14 months. Today's event was not random. It was a test. The ICU felt very quiet. A test of what? She said. Of you, the voice said. Specifically, to see if you'd surface. Claire looked at General Marsh. He was watching her with an expression that had gone carefully neutral, the look of a man who did not know who was on that phone and was very interested in finding out. "They knew about the program," she said. "They've known for longer than we have," the voice said, "which means they knew about you before we activated your position." A pause that had weight to it. "Ms. Bennett, Okafor had a second device. We found it 20 minutes ago. It wasn't intended for the general." She went still. "It was intended for whoever treated him. The second device was a modified transdermal patch. Same compound, higher concentration, engineered to activate on skin contact and designed to look, at a glance, like a standard medication label. It had been adhered to the underside of the IV stand beside the general's gurney. The exact IV stand that Claire had been leaning against for the better part of 3 hours. She found this out while still on the phone, in the specific awful way that you find out something has almost happened. The voice telling her calmly, in the measured cadence of someone reading from a report, and her brain receiving the information while simultaneously doing the math on how many times she'd touched that stand, how long exposure would have taken, what the clinical presentation would have looked like in someone who knew enough to recognize it, and might therefore, terrifyingly, have been able to partially self-treat before losing the capacity to do so. She hadn't touched the label. That was the only reason she was standing upright having this conversation. She'd moved the stand twice, both times by the pole, not the base. "Who are you?" she said into the phone. "My name is Hargrove, Deputy Director, and that's as specific as I'm going to be on an unsecured line." A pause. "I need you to stay in the building." I wasn't planning to leave. "I need you to stay in the building and not tell Colonel Rourke what I've just told you." She looked through the window at Rourke, who was still in the corridor, still watching her through the glass with the contained expression of a man running several calculations simultaneously. "Why not?" she said. "Because Rourke's communications were compromised 14 days ago. We don't know the extent." Another pause. "We're fairly confident he's not involved. But fairly confident isn't certain, and until it is, I need you to operate as if you're alone on this." She processed that. "The second device," she said. "Who planted it?" "Okafor had 30 minutes alone in that bay before the convoy arrived. We believe he placed it during the staged mechanical delay, the same one that kept 2 detail members from making the convoy." Hargrove's voice was flat and precise, a man used to delivering bad news without softening it. "The 2 missing detail members have been located. They're alive. They'll recover. And the network behind this. That's why I'm calling." A brief silence. "Okafor's phone produced 17 contacts in the past 90 days. 14 are military personnel currently under investigation. 2 are dead, both ruled accidental in the past 6 months, both now being re-examined. And 1—" He stopped. "One what?" she said. "One is a civilian contractor with a current security badge for Ironwood Veterans Medical Center." The ICU floor was quiet. Donna was at the nursing station. Novak was at a terminal. Derek was doing a med round on Bay 6. Everything looked exactly as it should look at 4:30 in the afternoon in a veterans hospital. The particular exhausted rhythm of a day that has been too long and isn't over yet. "Name," Claire said. Hargrove told her. She looked at the nursing station, at Donna Reyes, who was reviewing charts with her reading glasses on their beaded chain, moving through paperwork with the unhurried efficiency of someone who had been doing this job for 12 years and had outlasted every administrator who tried to tell her how to do it differently. "Contractor in what capacity?" Claire said. Her voice was level. "Hospital Operations Consulting. The contract was issued 8 months ago through a subsidiary that traces back, through 4 shell entities, to a foreign interest lobbying firm with documented ties to 2 of the 14 military personnel currently under investigation." Claire watched Donna turn a page. "She has access to the entire facility," Hargrove said. "Medication rooms, supply areas, patient records, and, because her contract covers facility security assessment, she has a master access card for all restricted areas. Including the ICU. Including the ICU. Claire exhaled through her nose. She kept her eyes on the nursing station. "What do you need from me?" Her access card records show she entered the medication supply room on floor 3 at 3:40 p.m. today. She's been on that floor for 50 minutes. We don't know what she's doing up there, but the supply room contains two things relevant to this situation: the hospital's remaining pralidoxime stock and the pharmaceutical refrigerator that holds the general's next treatment dose. Claire's jaw tightened. I have federal agents 4 minutes out, Hargrove said. I need you to keep the general's treatment stable and stay between him and anything coming from floor 3 until they arrive. 4 minutes, she said, boss. 3.5 now. Don't let Paulson move the general, she said. If they try to transport him, that's when the exposure risk goes up. Agreed. Can you manage the floor? She looked at the general, who was watching her from the gurney with the patient intelligence of someone who has been in enough rooms like this to know when a conversation is more serious than it appears. Yes, she said. She hung up. Okay. She moved to the nursing station the way she always moved, efficiently, without urgency, without anything in her posture that would read as alarm to anyone watching. She picked up a chart from the rack, opened it, stood beside Donna Reyes and looked at the page like she was reviewing medication orders. How are we doing on the general's next enzyme panel timing? She said. Donna glanced at her. Dr. Reyes said 5 p.m. I want to push it to 4:50. Can you pull the standing order and flag it? Sure. Donna reached for the keyboard. Also the treatment dose? It's in the pharmaceutical fridge on 3? A very brief pause. Not long. Not something most people would have caught. Standard storage, yes, I can have it brought down. Actually, I'll go, Claire said. I want to check the label myself. The compound is sensitive to temperature variance, and the fridge up there runs a little warm in my experience. Donna looked at her. You've been here one day. I've been in a lot of hospital fridges. She smiled. Not warm, not cold, neutral. The expression of someone who is slightly tedious about medication protocols. I'll be back in 5. She put the chart back and walked to the elevator. She did not look at Donna again. She did not check whether Donna was watching her. She kept her gait exactly the same all the way to the elevator doors, pressed the button, and stood with her hands in her scrub pockets and her back to the nursing station and her heart rate at a number she was managing by counting her own breaths. The elevator took 45 seconds to arrive. She rode it to the 3rd floor alone. Floor 3 was quieter than the ICU. Longer-term recovery patients, lower acuity, the particular afternoon stillness of a ward where most of the action happened in the morning and the evening and the hours between were a waiting period that everyone on staff navigated in their own way. A nursing aide was restocking a linen cart at the far end of the corridor. 2 visitors moved toward the elevator bank. Nobody looked at her. The medication supply room was at the midpoint of the corridor, a door with a keypad and a small window at eye level. She could see through the window that the light inside was on. She stood to the side of the door and listened. Movement inside. The particular sound of a refrigerator being opened. The seal releasing. The small rush of cool air. Then something else. A sound that took her a moment to categorize, and when she did, her attention sharpened in a very specific way. The sound of a syringe being drawn. She had no badge. No access card. She was a float nurse who had been terminated 8 hours ago and reinstated in a de facto way that hadn't produced any actual paperwork. She had no weapon, no radio, no federal credentials, and the agents Hargrove had promised were still, she checked her watch, approximately 90 seconds out. She also had a linen cart 6 feet away, which the aide had temporarily abandoned to answer something on her phone around the corner. She looked at the cart, at the supply room door, at the window. Then she went to the cart, picked up a stack of folded towels, and knocked on the supply room door with her knuckle. The knock of someone who has both hands full and is doing it with the back of their hand. Annoying. Routine. A pause inside. Then the door opened. Donna Reyes stood in the doorway with a single syringe in her left hand, and the master access card clipped to her lanyard, and the expression of someone who had expected a colleague and had found something more complicated instead. For a full second, neither of them moved. You came up here for towels, Donna said. I came up here for the treatment dose, Claire said. Donna's eyes moved to the syringe in her hand. She looked at it with the strange, dissociated expression of someone watching themselves from outside their own body. The expression of a person who has been doing something very carefully for a long time and has just been observed in the middle of it. Step back inside, Claire said. Please. Donna didn't step back. She stepped forward, and her left hand, the one with the syringe, came up in the motion of someone who has made a decision and is now committed to the physics of it, and Claire dropped the towels and caught her wrist with both hands and drove it up and back in a move that had nothing graceful about it and everything functional. And the syringe went into the wall above the doorframe and stayed there, needle first, while Donna's back hit the doorframe, and she made a sound that was half pain and half something else. They stayed like that for a moment, Claire with Donna's wrist pinned above her head, Donna breathing hard, the syringe above them both in the wall. "Don't," Claire said, just the word. Donna stopped trying. The elevator at the end of the corridor opened 30 seconds later, and 2 federal agents in civilian clothes came through it at a pace that stopped just short of running, and the nursing aide came around the corner from wherever she'd been and saw them and pressed herself against the wall with both hands over her mouth. And Claire held Donna Reyes against the doorframe until the agents had her, and then she stepped back and put her own hands flat against her thighs and breathed. One of the agents, a woman, close-cropped hair, the economical movements of someone who has done this many times, looked at the syringe in the wall. "Don't touch it," Claire said. "The needle and whatever's in it needs to go to your lab." The agent looked at her. "You're Bennett?" "Yes." "Hargrove said to tell you the 4 minutes was optimistic, and he's sorry." "It was 3 minutes 40, Claire said. "Close enough." Ahmad. Donna Reyes did not speak until she was in the federal agent's custody, and then she spoke extensively, which Hargrove relayed to Claire 40 minutes later in a phone call that was more detailed than the first one, conducted on a secured line that one of the agents had provided. She had been recruited 2 years ago, not through coercion, through money, a significant sum, structured through the same shell company chain that had provided her consulting contract. The contract itself had been the mechanism. It gave her access to the facility, a legitimate reason to be in restricted areas, and cover for any behavioral anomalies that might otherwise have prompted questions. She had not known about Okafor specifically. The network operated in cells, and she was not privy to the full scope of the operation. What she had known was that a high-value target was being brought to this facility today, and that her role was to ensure the treatment failed. The syringe in the wall contained a concentrated dose of the same synthetic compound that had been used on the general. Administered into his IV line during a routine medication round, it would have looked, initially, like a treatment complication. By the time anyone understood what they were looking at, the window would have closed. She had also, Hargrove told Claire, flagged the nursing staff roster 6 weeks ago. She had flagged Claire's application. Claire sat with that for a moment. "She knew I was coming," she said. "She passed the information up her chain," Hargrove said. "We don't know yet what they did with it, but yes, whoever built this operation had your name before you walked in this morning." "And Holloway?" A pause. "No connection to the network. Background check is clean." Another pause. "He made some calls today after the situation in the Bay. He called the hospital board. He called the credentialing office." Hargrove's voice was careful. "He was trying to get your termination reversed." She looked out the window of the small staff room where she'd taken the call. The afternoon had gone gray and then darker gray, and the parking lot lights had come on in the last hour, and the hospital looked from up here exactly as hospitals always look from above. Busy, lit, full of people for whom today was just another day. "Why are you telling me that?" she said. "Because you should know who's in your corner," Hargrove said. "It's a short list and it's worth knowing." She went back to the ICU at 5:15. The General's 5 p.m. enzyme panel had been delayed by events on floor 3. Priya Reyes had held it until Claire returned, with a look that asked several questions she diplomatically didn't voice. And now it ran at 5:20, and the results came back at 5:45, with a number that made Reyes remove her reading glasses and rub her eyes in what was clearly relief rather than fatigue. 61%. Up from 38. The trajectory was no longer just positive. It was decisive. "He's going to make it," Reyes said. Not to anyone specifically. To the room. The general was awake, more alert than he'd been all day, and when Claire came to the gurney to review the results, he looked at her with the particular clarity of someone whose mind had been fighting through fog for several hours and had now largely won. "Floor 3, he said. "Handled," she said. "I heard some of it," he said. "The agents talking in the corridor." She sat in the chair beside the gurney. She was tired in the bone-deep way that she'd been managing since early afternoon, and she let it show slightly because there was no one in this bay right now who she needed to perform steadiness for. "Donna Reyes," he said. "Yes." "How long?" 2 years. He looked at the ceiling for a moment. "She helped onboard 2 members of my security rotation in the last 18 months. Part of the contractor's scope, facility security assessment, included personnel recommendations." He paused. "Which means she may have been involved in placing Okafor." "Paulson's team will find the chain," Claire said. "They have her communications. They have the network contacts from Okafor's phone. Both threads lead to the same architecture." She looked at the monitor. "It'll unravel." "Things like this don't always unravel cleanly," he said. "No," she said. "They don't." He looked at her. "You sound like someone who's watched one not unravel." She didn't answer that. He accepted the silence. "What do you need?" "Right now? Coffee," she said. "And about 6 hours of sleep." He almost smiled again. It was becoming a thing he did around her. This almost smile. Like the full version was a tool he'd stopped using regularly and hadn't found a reason to take back out. "After that," he said. "After that, I need to know what Hargrove's operation looks like in practice," she said. "Not the recruitment pitch, the actual day-to-day. Because if today is what the day-to-day looks like, I have some thoughts about staffing and threat assessment protocols that someone should probably write down." This time, the smile made it. "I'll set up the meeting," he said. Work found her in the break room at 6 p.m. She was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold and a piece of paper on which she'd been writing nothing in particular, just working through the day's timeline, trying to identify the gaps, the places where decisions had been made quickly and could have gone differently. It was a habit from her other life. After action in your own head because the formal version takes weeks, and you need to think through it before the memory softens. He sat down across from her. "I've been briefed," he said, "on the comms compromise, on Hargrove." She wrapped both hands around the cold coffee cup. "And I need you to know that I didn't—" "I know," she said. Hargrove said fairly confident. "I was already at certain." He looked at her. "How?" "Because you called me in the convoy," she said, "before you knew whether the treatment was going to work, before you knew whether the facility was secure, before you knew anything except that you had a dying patient and a name. If you were part of the network, you'd have let the treatment fail. You wouldn't have called someone who could fix it." He was quiet for a moment. "That's a short chain of reasoning." "It's a good one." He looked at his hands on the table. He was tired. She could see it now, the fatigue that had been sitting under his military bearing all day finally visible. His right hand was still doing the slow open and close. 18 months, he said again. "I know. I'm going to have to rebuild the entire detail." "Yes." He looked up. "How do you do this?" "Work in environments where you can't—" He stopped. "Where the people around you might be—" "You assume the best until you have evidence otherwise," she said, "and you watch the evidence." "That's very exhausting," she said. "I know, but the alternative is assuming the worst, and then you can't function in a unit and you end up alone, and that's its own kind of problem." He was quiet for a moment. "Did you know it was Donna?" "Not until the call," she said. "I had a feeling about Okafor earlier, the weight distribution, the watch checking. Donna, I missed." She paused. "I should have caught it earlier. She controlled the narrative on this floor all day. She's the one who told me you were pulling into the east gate. She took the call from the convoy." "Which means she knew the convoy was coming." "Which means she knew, and she had a window to warn someone, and she used it." Claire set the coffee cup down. "I should have been watching her from the moment I saw the IV stand." "You were managing a poisoned 4-star general and an active security threat simultaneously," Rourke said. "That's not an excuse." "No," he said, "but it's a reason." He looked at her steadily. "You can't catch everything, Bennett. Nobody can." She looked at the paper in front of her, the timeline, the gaps. "I know," she said. She didn't entirely believe it, but she knew it. At 7:30 p.m., Dr. Richard Holloway knocked on the open door of the break room. He looked, for the first time since she'd met him, like a man who'd had a long day and was willing to show it. His tie was loosened. His sleeves were rolled up. There were 2 cups of coffee in his hands, actual hot coffee, which meant he'd been to the vending machine on the first floor, which was the only source of hot coffee in the building at this hour. He set one of the cups in front of her. She looked at it. "It's bad," he said. "Machine coffee always is." "Thank you," she said. He sat down, not in the chair Rourke had used, across the room, at the edge of the table, the body language of someone who wasn't sure of his welcome and was leaving himself an exit. She found it oddly humanizing. "The board called," he said. She wrapped her hands around the hot cup. "I told them what happened, with the termination this morning and the—" He stopped. "With everything that happened after." He looked at the table. "They want to meet with you." "For what purpose?" "To reinstate your position formally, with a contract rather than a float assignment." He looked up. "And to discuss what my conduct this morning was. In front of the staff. In front of the patient." She didn't say anything. "I was wrong," he said. "I need to say that directly. The imaging, yes, that was a clinical error, and those have a process. But what I did in the ICU, in front of your colleagues, on your first day, that was—" He seemed to be looking for the honest word rather than the diplomatic one. "That was wrong. It was an abuse of the authority I have in that room. And it wasn't only wrong because it turned out you were right. It was wrong before that." She looked at him. He met her eyes. He didn't look away. "The patient from this morning," she said. "The bowel resection. Surgery is rescheduled for Thursday. Corrected approach. I briefed him personally." He paused. "I told him there had been an error in the original imaging assessment." "Did you tell him whose error?" A long pause. "Yes." She nodded. "The board meeting," she said. "What do you want to happen in it?" He blinked, like no one had asked him that. "I'd like you to be reinstated." "And?" "And I'd like—" He stopped again. Another long pause of a man reaching for the honest version. "I'd like to not have done what I did this morning. I can't have that, so I'd like to—" He looked at the table. "Make it something that's in the record accurately." "Meaning you want it documented." "Meaning I reported it to the board before they heard it elsewhere." "Yes." She looked at him for a long moment. This was the most honest she'd seen him, stripped of the authority and the cadence and the careful performance of competence. Just a man in a break room with bad vending machine coffee who had done something wrong and had decided, at some point in the last several hours, not to pretend otherwise. "Okay," she said. He looked up. "I'll meet with the board," she said, "and I'd like Novak in the room." "Novak?" "She's good," Claire said. "She asked the right question when no one else was asking questions. She should be in the room when the decisions get made." He sat with that for a moment. "All right." "And Mr. Villanueva in Bay 4 gets daily checks from me personally until he discharges. No handoffs." "Done." She picked up the coffee. It was bad. She drank it anyway. At 9:15 p.m., Paulson came to the ICU. She came alone, which was notable, and she came without her laptop, which was more notable, and she stood in the doorway of the general's bay with the careful expression of someone who is about to say something that changes the shape of the conversation. "The network," she said. "We have the architecture." The general was sitting at 45 degrees, his enzyme activity now at 74% and climbing, his color returned to something approximating normal. He looked at Paulson. "How extensive?" he said. 14 military personnel, as Hargrove indicated, 3 federal contractors, 2 elected officials at the state level whose communications show foreknowledge of the operation. She paused. And 1 person at the senior level of the Veterans Health Administration, with system-wide access to facility records, staffing recommendations, and contractor approvals. The room was quiet. "The consulting contract that put Donna Reyes in this building," Paulson said. "It was approved through a VHA administrator named Walter Garth, Deputy Director of Facility Operations." She looked at Claire. "Garth has access to every veterans medical facility in the country. He approved 47 contractor placements in the last 18 months. The number landed. 47. Claire looked at Paulson. The program. Hargrove's program. The personnel placed in veterans facilities with classified backgrounds. Yes, Paulson said. We're currently assessing which of those placements may have been compromised by Garth's access to the placement records. How many facilities? 31, potentially. Paulson's voice was controlled. We're treating it as active threat assessment for all 31 simultaneously. The general had gone very still. And Garth, he said. We moved on him at 8:47 p.m., Paulson said. Federal custody. He was attempting to board a flight out of Dulles. The room breathed. He had a phone, Paulson continued. Encrypted. Our team is working through the contents now, but in the first pass, in the first 20 minutes, they found one file. She looked at Claire. A personnel file. Your full classified record. Name, assignment history, current placement, medical training background. She paused. The file had been accessed 6 days ago, and it had been forwarded to an external address. The quiet in the room was different now, denser. Forwarded to whom? The general said. Paulson looked at Claire with an expression that was as close to apologetic as federal liaison officers probably got. We don't know yet, she said. The external address routes through a proxy chain that our team is currently working to unwrap, but the metadata on the forward shows it was received and opened. She paused. And there was a response. What did the response say? Claire said. Paulson reached into her jacket and produced a single printed page. She held it out. Claire took it. The message was 4 words. We know she's there. She read the 4 words twice. Then she folded the paper and set it on the gurney beside the general's hand and stood up. When was the response sent? She said. Timestamp puts it at 6:43 p.m., Paulson said. 3 hours ago. Which means whoever received my file knew I was in this building, knew what I could do, and had 3 hours to decide what to do with that information. She looked at the window. The parking lot below was lit and quiet. And in those 3 hours, nothing happened. Which means they're waiting, Rourke said from the doorway. He'd been there long enough that she didn't know when he'd arrived. Or they already moved and we don't know it yet, Claire said. Paulson, the 31 facilities. Has anyone started contact protocols? Teams are being activated now. We should have preliminary assessments within. Who's coordinating the activation? Deputy Director Hargrove. And Hargrove's chain is clean? Verified at 7 p.m., independent of Garth's office. She nodded. Then the facilities are being handled. She looked at the general. His face was composed, but there was something underneath it. Not fear, more like the weight of a man who has just understood the full scale of what was aimed at him and is doing the arithmetic on what it means. The message wasn't operational, she said. It was a signal. To who? The general said. To whoever has been running this network above Garth's level. Someone who knew about me, knew about the program, and wanted us to find that message in Garth's phone. She paused. You don't leave a 4-word response on an encrypted device that you know is going to be seized unless you want it found. Paulson looked at her. You think it's misdirection. I think it's pressure, designed to make us reactive, to make us move the general, change the protocol, expose additional personnel or safe sites in the scramble. She looked at the message in her hand. If we start pulling personnel from 31 facilities tonight based on a 4-word message on a compromised phone, we create gaps. Gaps are opportunities. The room was quiet. So we don't move, Rourke said. We don't move anything that doesn't need to move, she said. We finish the general's treatment. We complete the enzyme protocol. We let Paulson's team work through the proxy chain on that external address. And in the morning, we know who sent the message, and we go from there. She looked at the general. You're 60 hours from a clean panel and a medically sound discharge. In 60 hours, the operational window for a second attempt is effectively closed, and the network loses its primary objective. And if I'm wrong, she said, before anyone else could, if the message is real and there's something moving tonight that we don't know about, she held the question in the room for a moment. Then we deal with it when it arrives, she said. Same as we dealt with everything else today. You handle what's in front of you. You don't run from shadows and sacrifice your position for the sake of movement. The general looked at her for a long moment. Then he reached out and picked up the folded paper from the gurney. He held it for a moment without opening it. "Stay," he said. "Tonight." She looked at him. "In the building," he said. "I'm not asking you to sit in this bay all night, but I'd like you in the building." She thought about her apartment, the quiet, the 3 years of careful, constructed distance from rooms exactly like this one. She thought about the drive home through October rain and the particular silence of a space where nothing is at stake and nothing is required of you. "There's a call room on 2, she said. "Does it have a working lock?" "It does," Donna said, and then caught herself. The wrong Donna, not Donna Reyes, who was in federal custody, but Derek, who had appeared behind Paulson and then wished he hadn't spoken because now everyone was looking at him. "Sorry, Dr. Reyes asked me to say that the 10 p.m. panel is ready when you are." "Tell her 5 minutes, Claire said. The 10 p.m. panel came back at 81%. Priya Reyes looked at it and said good, in the way that good means we won. And then she ordered a follow-up at 6 a.m. and went home because she'd been on for 14 hours and her hands were starting to shake in the minor way that happens when excellent physicians push past the point where they should have handed off to someone else. Claire stayed. She did the 11 p.m. monitoring check herself and found the general awake, sitting at 60 degrees, looking at the window with the expression of a man going through a very large mental inventory. "You should sleep," she said. "So should you." "I will, in about an hour." He looked at the window. 47 facilities, he said. 18 months of placements. "Yes." "That's not an opportunistic operation," he said. "That took planning, infrastructure, access at a level that required someone inside the system for a long time before Garth." "Paulson's team will find the chain," she said. "And if the chain goes higher than we think?" She checked the IV line. "Then it goes higher than we think, and we follow it until we find the top, and then we deal with the top." "Simple as that." "No," she said. "Hard as that. But still that." He looked at her. "You're not afraid of it." She thought about whether that was true. "I'm afraid of plenty of things," she said. "I'm afraid of the things I didn't catch today. I'm afraid of the 31 facilities and the people in them who may not know what's coming. I'm afraid of the proxy chain on that message resolving to somewhere we didn't expect." She straightened up. "But the network and the scale and the people at the top, no, I'm not afraid of those. I'm just oriented toward them." He was quiet for a moment. "That's an interesting way to describe it." "It's the accurate one." She made a note in the chart. "I spent 3 years trying to be done with this. I was very deliberate about it. I built something that looked like a normal life, and I was moderately good at it, and some days it even felt like the right decision. And today?" She looked at him. "Today I stood in your emergency bay and I knew what I was looking at, and I knew what to do about it, and I didn't hesitate." She paused. "That's not something you build out of a normal life. That's something you build out of years of doing the work and paying the price of the work." She set the chart down. "I didn't stop needing to sleep when I left. I didn't stop having bad days or second-guessing myself or being afraid of the wrong things at the wrong times. I just stopped doing the thing I'm built for." "And now?" he said. "Now," she said, "I think I'll call Hargrove in the morning." The general nodded once. It was the nod of a man who had been waiting for that sentence and was wise enough not to say so. "Get some sleep," she said. "You're 6 a.m. Panel is going to be good, and I want you to be awake to hear the number." "Good night, Lieutenant," he said. She stopped at the door. He'd used the rank deliberately. She knew that. It wasn't an accident and it wasn't a slip. It was a man with significant institutional authority, saying in the only language those rooms speak, "I see what you are, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise." "Good night, sir," she said, and went to find the call room. The proxy chain resolved at 4:17 a.m. Paulson called her on the secured phone that one of the agents had left with her, and Claire was awake before the second ring because she'd been in a kind of shallow sleep that wasn't quite rest, the sleep of someone whose brain has decided that full unconsciousness is not appropriate to the situation. "The external address," Paulson said. "It traces to a communications contractor in Northern Virginia. The contractor has a known client list, primarily defense adjacent. One client has a documented relationship with 2 of the 14 military personnel under investigation. A pause. The client is a lobbying firm, registered 3 years ago. The primary principal is a man named Stuart Vane. Claire sat up. The call room was dark and smelled like institutional cleaning products and stale air. Vane, she said. You know the name. I know the firm, she said carefully. It appeared in a threat assessment 18 months ago. The assessment was flagged, and then, quietly, the flag was removed. By Garth's office, Paulson said. Almost certainly. She swung her legs off the narrow bed. Do you have enough for a warrant? We have enough for 3. A pause that had satisfaction in it without being unprofessional about it. Teams moved on Vane at 4 a.m. He was at his primary residence in McLean. He's in federal custody as of 12 minutes ago. She pressed the heel of her hand against her eye. And the other principals? 6 individuals connected to the firm's operational arm, all in custody or in process. We expect to have everyone contained by 0600. The network. 18 months of infrastructure, 47 facility placements, a 4-star general, a synthetic compound designed to evade detection, and 1 corporal who had checked his watch twice in 12 minutes. All of it resolving at 4 a.m. in a series of federal warrants executed while the city slept. The 31 facilities, she said. The personnel. Preliminary assessments are in. 28 are confirmed clean, hosts. The contractor placements were either inactive, unaware, or never activated. 3 are being looked at more closely. She paused. No active threats beyond what we've already contained. We're fairly confident the Ironwood operation was the only one that went live. Today, Claire said. Today, Paulson agreed. The others may have been positioned for future operations. We'll know more as the interviews progress. She looked at the dark ceiling of the call room. Paulson, she said. Yes. Good work. A pause. You too, Bennett. The 6 a.m. panel came back at 93%. Priya Reyes arrived at 5:50, looking like someone who had slept exactly as much as the situation warranted and was professionally functional regardless. And she reviewed the results with her reading glasses on and said, excellent, and ordered 1 final panel for noon and a clinical discharge assessment for the afternoon. The general looked at the number on the printout and then looked at Claire. Told you, she said. He handed the printout back. You did. At 9 a.m., the hospital board meeting happened. It was not the meeting that had been planned. It was smaller than it should have been and larger than it needed to be, held in the glass-walled conference room on the administrative floor with 7 board members, Holloway, Novak, Donna, the charge nurse Donna Reyes, who had come in for a 7 a.m. shift and had been told in the conference room doorway that her counterpart of the same name was in federal custody, and who had spent 3 minutes sitting very still in the break room before deciding she was fine and coming into the meeting. And Claire. And Rourke, who arrived at 8:55 in full-dress uniform, which he wore the way some people wear armor and some people wear skin, and which communicated something to the 7 board members before he said a single word. The board chair was a woman named Margaret Osai, 60, precise, the kind of person who had run enough meetings to know the difference between a difficult one and an important one, and was visibly treating this as both. She opened the meeting by reading from a prepared statement about Ironwood's policies on staff conduct and due process, and Claire sat at the table and let her read it because the statement was accurate and there wasn't anything in it to argue with. Then Holloway spoke. He spoke for 11 minutes without notes. He described what had happened in the ICU the previous morning, the interruption, his response to it, the termination, with the particular precision of a man who has been over the sequence many times in his own head and has arrived at a version that doesn't spare himself. He didn't editorialize. He didn't contextualize it into something more comfortable. He described a clinical error that he had made and a conduct failure that had followed it, and the consequences of both. The board members listened. Ms. Bennett identified a potentially critical imaging error during her first hour on this floor, he said. She brought it to my attention in a professional manner. I dismissed her. I then terminated her employment in a manner that was disproportionate, inappropriate, and contrary to the culture that this facility is supposed to represent. He paused. The patient whose surgery she flagged is scheduled for a corrected procedure on Thursday. He's been informed of the original error and the correction. He looked at Claire. If she had not said something, if I had not eventually reviewed the imaging, that patient would have had an incomplete surgery followed by a second operation to address what the first one missed. That is a direct clinical consequence of what I failed to do. The room was quiet. I've also submitted a formal incident report through the credentialing office, he said. That's in the record independent of this meeting. Margaret Osei looked at the table, then at Claire. Ms. Bennett, is there anything you'd like to add? Claire had thought about what she wanted to say. She'd had the call room and 3 hours of shallow sleep to think about it, which was probably more preparation than the situation strictly required. Dr. Holloway made an error and he's corrected it, she said. I don't have anything to add to his account because it's accurate. She paused. What I'd like is for resident Novak to be present at any future case reviews that involve float or contract staff. She demonstrated sound clinical judgment yesterday under significant pressure, and that judgment contributed to a patient outcome. That should be in her record. Novak, across the table, looked at her hands. And I'd like the imaging review process to include a second opinion mechanism for any procedure over a defined risk threshold, Claire continued. Not as a punitive measure, as a structural one. Errors happen. The system should be designed to catch them before they reach the patient. Margaret Osei made a note. Is that all? That's all, Claire said. The board took 22 minutes to deliberate. When they came back, the reinstatement was formal and documented, with a contract rather than a float assignment, at a salary that reflected the classification level of her actual background, rather than the entry-level number on the original posting. Holloway received a formal disciplinary notation in his file, not a suspension, not a termination, but a permanent record, and was required to complete a staff conduct review with the credentialing office before returning to surgical privileges. He accepted it without argument. On the way out of this conference room, he stopped beside her in the doorway. The imaging protocol proposal, he said. I'd like to develop it jointly, if you're willing. She looked at him. He was not comfortable asking, that was evident. He was asking anyway. Send me the draft, she said. I'll review it. He nodded once, and then he went down the hallway, and she went the other way. And that was the end of it, and the beginning of something else, which is how most things work when they work. Thus, the general was discharged at 3:40 p.m. His noon panel had come back at 97%, close enough to baseline that Priya Reyes had cleared him with the recommendation of a 2-week restricted schedule and a follow-up panel in 10 days. He accepted these terms with the expression of a man who had no intention of following them to the letter, but understood the value of appearing cooperative. Claire was in the bay when they prepared to move him. 2 new detail members, vetted through a process that Rourke had apparently conducted personally and with considerable thoroughness, brought a wheelchair that the general looked at for a moment before deciding to stand. I can walk, he said. The chair's protocol, the new detail lead said. I know what the chair is, the general said, and stood up, and the detail lead looked at Rourke, and Rourke looked at Claire, and Claire looked at the general. Compromise, she said. Wheelchair to the elevator. You walk from the lobby. He considered this. Fine. She handed his chart to Priya Reyes and walked with them to the elevator. At the bay door she stopped, because her presence in the discharge process ended here. She wasn't his personal physician, she wasn't military, and the corridor beyond belonged to a process that didn't need her in it. He turned before he got into the wheelchair. The morning meeting with Hargrove, he said. I'll be on the call. I figured, she said. There are things I want to tell him about how this program should be structured, he said, based on what I observed yesterday, specifically about how personnel are identified and supported and whether the current model adequately... General, she said. He stopped. Go home, she said. You were poisoned yesterday. The meeting can wait until tomorrow. He looked at her for a moment. Then he sat down in the wheelchair. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, she said. Rourke, passing by, caught her eye. He didn't say anything, but there was something in his face that hadn't been there at 6:47 a.m. yesterday when she'd stood at this hospital's entrance reading the directory with her badge clipped to her scrubs and her whole careful constructed life intact around her. She didn't have a name for it. Respect was the easy word, and the easy word was usually approximate. It was something more specific than that. The recognition of one person who has been in difficult places for another person who has been in difficult places, and the wordless acknowledgement that this is a thing that marks you whether you want it to or not. She nodded at him. He nodded back, and the elevator doors closed. She spent the rest of the afternoon on the floor. Bay 4 first, Mr. Villanueva, who was doing well, whose hematoma had resolved, who looked at her when she came in and said, "You again," with the satisfied expression of a man who had correctly assessed something. "Me again," she said. "They said you left." "I came back." "Why?" She checked his chart. His pressure was normal. His color was good. He was, by the numbers and by appearance, fine. "Because I said I would," she said. He watched her work. "You have a way of moving," he said, "like you're thinking about 6 things and you're only showing me 2 of them." She looked up. "My daughter does that," he said. "She was in the army." "Was?" "Is. She re-enlisted last year." He paused. "She doesn't talk about it much." "No," Claire said. "Most of us don't." He was quiet for a moment. "Is that okay? Not talking about it?" She thought about the honest answer rather than the comfortable one. "It depends on what you're not talking about," she said. "Some things shouldn't be talked about in general company. Some things should be talked about with specific people who can hold them properly." She set the chart down. "If she has people like that, then yes, it's okay." He nodded slowly. "And if she doesn't?" "Then she's working on finding them," Claire said. "Same as everyone else." She left Bay 4 and walked the rest of the floor. A full check, every bay. The methodical, unhurried round of a nurse who is learning the topology of a new space and intends to know it thoroughly. She knew the names of every patient on the floor by 5 p.m. She knew which ones had family coming and which ones didn't. She knew which aide was reliable in a crisis and which one froze, which she'd assessed from the 3rd-floor linen card episode and filed away. Derek found her at the nursing station at 5:30. "You're still here," he said. "I work here," she said. He looked at her badge, the new one, printed with her name and the word staff instead of float, which was a small difference and a significant one. "I heard about what happened in the board meeting." "Who told you?" "Novak." He paused. "She was pretty great in there, apparently." "She was," Claire said. "She also said you recommended her for the case review committee." "I made a suggestion. The board decides." He leaned against the station. "Why'd you do that?" She looked at the board, the patient roster, the assignment sheet, the ordinary administrative landscape of a floor in the middle of a shift. "Because she asked the right question at the right time, and nobody noticed," she said. "Somebody should notice." He was quiet for a moment. "I should have pushed back more," he said. "This morning, when Holloway—" "You were a staff nurse on your floor with a senior physician in the room," she said. "You did what most people do. It's not an accusation." Still, she agreed. "But you can decide what you do next time. That's the only moment that's actually available to you." He looked at her. Then he stood up straight. "Can I ask you something?" "You can try." "What was it like? In the Bay? When you knew what was wrong and everyone else was doing the wrong thing?" She thought about it honestly. Not the cleaned-up version, the actual thing. "Frustrating," she said. "And lonely. And then just necessary. You get to a point where the emotion becomes less useful than the action, and you switch over." "How do you know when to switch?" "When the patient can't wait for you to finish feeling things," she said. "That's usually the signal." He nodded slowly. "I want to be better at that." "Then you will be," she said. "It takes time, and it takes bad days. There isn't a shortcut." He went back to his rounds, and she stood at the nursing station for a moment longer, just a moment, looking at the floor that was hers now in a way that it hadn't been at 6:47 yesterday morning when she'd stood at this same station and been handed a stack of orientation paperwork by a woman who told her not to be memorable. She would be memorable. She knew that now. She had always known it, probably, in the part of herself that she'd been very deliberately quieting for 3 years. She was not someone who disappeared easily, and the attempts she'd made to do so had not made her smaller. They just made the space around her feel too large. She picked up the next chart. At 6:15 p.m., Hargrove called. She took the call in the stairwell. Habit, the instinct toward enclosed spaces for sensitive conversations, and leaned against the wall with the phone pressed to her ear and the sounds of the hospital muffled above and below her. Walter Garth gave his first substantial statement at 2 p.m., Hargrove said. He's cooperating. How substantial? 18 months of operational detail, names, accounts, communication protocols. He's giving us everything because he's smart enough to understand that the people above him are not going to protect him, and his best option is to be the most cooperative person in the room. A pause. Stuart Vane, on the other hand, has said nothing. His attorney arrived at 5 a.m., and they've been in conference for 12 hours. Vane doesn't need to talk, she said. Garth's statement and Okafor's phone and Donna Rea's communications and the pen mechanism and the chain of 47 contractor placements. That's a case that doesn't require Vane's cooperation to prosecute. Agreed. The U.S. Attorney's Office had the same assessment. They're moving forward regardless. Another pause. Vane's firm is being dissolved. Federal seizure of assets pending trial. The two state officials, their offices have already been notified and both have retained counsel. She thought about the architecture of it, the planning it had taken, the years of patient infiltration, the institutional access built one contractor placement at a time, the network assembled with such careful incrementalism that each individual piece looked like normal bureaucracy until you saw all of it at once. Who built this? She said. At the top, above Vane. That's the question, Hargrove said. We have hypotheses. We're working the chain. He paused. This is going to be a long investigation, Bennett. Years, not months. I know. Are you in? She looked at the stairwell, the institutional green paint, the scuffed concrete steps. Above her, the sounds of the hospital. The particular sound of a place where people are being cared for, imperfectly and with significant effort by people who are tired and trying anyway. Send me the program structure, she said. I have some thoughts about how it should be changed. Is that a yes? It's a starting point, she said. We'll get to yes after I read the fine print. He laughed. A short, genuine sound that surprised her. Fair enough. I'll have it to you tonight. Make it tomorrow, she said. I'm still on shift. But at 7:45 p.m., the floor finally quieted. The evening shift had come on at 7. Claire had briefed the incoming nurse, a compact, efficient woman named Petra, who had worked the ICU for 8 years and took the handoff with the brisk professionalism of someone who did not need things explained twice, and then stood at the nursing station for a moment doing the mental inventory of a shift ending. Every patient accounted for, every flag addressed, every open item either resolved or handed off with full context. It was, she realized, a good shift, objectively. The crisis was yesterday's crisis, and the floor was functioning and her patients were stable, and she had done the ordinary work of nursing with the same attention she brought to the extraordinary work. Because the ordinary work was how you earned the right to do the extraordinary kind, and because Mr. Villanueva's pressure and his surgical site and his particular phrase, different kind of 7, mattered as much as anything else that had happened in this building in the last 36 hours. Novak found her at the elevator. The resident looked like she'd been awake for approximately as long as Claire had, which was an impressive amount of awake for a person who was also supposed to be learning medicine. She had a coffee in each hand and offered one to Claire with the wordless efficiency of someone who had made a decision about a relationship before fully thinking it through and was now committed to it. Claire took the coffee. Dr. Holloway asked me to assist on the bowel resection Thursday, Novak said. Good. He's also... She stopped. He's been different since yesterday. Different how? Novak thought about it. Like he's listening more. Not performing listening, actually doing it. She paused. I've been on his service for 7 months. I've never seen him ask a nurse a clinical question without framing it as a test. He asked me a question this morning that wasn't a test, Claire said. What did he ask? What else do you need? She pressed the elevator button. It's a small thing, but it's a different question than the ones he was asking yesterday morning. Novak was quiet for a moment. Do people actually change? Or is it circumstance? Both, Claire said. Circumstance creates the pressure. The change is the choice you make under it. The elevator arrived. Some people make it and some don't. Holloway made it. That's not nothing. Novak looked at her coffee. What about you? Claire looked at her. Did you change? Novak said. Coming back here? After everything. She thought about the apartment, the quiet, the 3 years, the drive she'd been about to take yesterday morning at 9:55 a.m. to somewhere unspecified where she could sit in a parking lot and be nobody in particular for a while. I came back to who I was, she said. I'm not sure that's a change. Maybe that's harder, Novak said. The elevator opened and Claire stepped in. She held the door for a moment, looking back at the resident standing in the hallway with her coffee and her 7 months of Holloway's service behind her and whatever was ahead. Get some sleep, Novak, she said. You too. She let the door close. Done. She sat in her car in the parking lot for about 10 minutes before starting the engine. Not because she was avoiding going home. She was tired enough that home was genuinely appealing. The apartment, the quiet, the specific relief of a bed that belonged to her in a room where nothing required her attention. She sat in the car because she needed the 10 minutes to let the day decompress to a size she could carry. And she'd learned over many years that this was what the transition required. Not denial, not forced resolution, just time to let the shape of things settle. The network was dismantling. She'd read the first update on her phone before leaving the floor. 3 of the 14 military personnel had formally agreed to cooperate, and their cooperation, layered onto Garth's statement and the communications chain, was producing new names at a rate that Paulson's team described as significant. The 47 contractor placements were being audited individually. The 3 facilities flagged for closer examination were being addressed with quiet precision by people who knew what they were looking at and had the authority to act on it. Okafor would be prosecuted. So would Donna Reyes. So would Garth and Vane and the 2 state officials and the 14 military personnel and everyone else whose name appeared in the chain. There would be trials, and the trials would take time, and not every verdict would feel proportionate, and some threads would go cold before they could be followed to their end. That was how it worked. That was what Unravel actually looked like when you were inside it rather than watching it resolve cleanly from a distance. The general would recover. His enzyme activity was trending toward normal, and his body was doing the laborious, unglamorous work of clearing a toxin it hadn't been designed to encounter, and in 2 weeks he'd be at 97%. And in a month, he'd probably be at a conference somewhere delivering a presentation with the unremarkable good health of a man who had come very close to something and had the good fortune not to have to think about it every day. She'd think about it every day. That was the job. She started the engine. The drive home was 22 minutes, and it was quiet. And she let it be quiet instead of filling it with the radio or phone calls or the particular productive busyness she sometimes used to avoid her own head. She drove, and she thought about the program. Hargrove's structure, the gaps she'd already identified, the things she wanted changed before she formalized anything. She thought about Novak and the case review committee and the imaging protocol proposal she'd told Holloway to draft and send her. She thought about Mr. Villanueva's daughter, who was in the Army and didn't talk about it much. She thought about the years she'd been someone who worked in a place like Ironwood under her own name, with a float staff badge in an ordinary apartment, and the daily, deliberate practice of wanting nothing more than what was in front of her. She had tried to be done. It was a reasonable thing to try. People left difficult work all the time for reasons that were legitimate and human and entirely defensible, and they built other lives, and those lives were real, and those lives had value. But she had not been done. She'd been resting. And there's a difference. She understood it fully now, in the specific way that you understand things that can only be learned by living them and not by being told, between rest and retreat. Rest ends when it's supposed to. Retreat doesn't end. Retreat just extends itself until it becomes the whole shape of your life, and you stop being able to see past it. She had walked out of a hospital yesterday morning with her hands not shaking and nothing waiting for her except the quiet of a carefully managed life. And then the phone had rung. And she had answered it, because she had always been going to answer it. Some part of her had known that from the moment she'd submitted the application to Ironwood, the position posted 6 weeks ago, float staff, a hospital full of veterans, a parking lot with a flagpole and a monument at the entrance that she'd stopped in front of for a moment before going inside. She hadn't stopped because of the monument. She'd stopped because she'd recognized something in the particular quality of the place, the way it held its purpose without advertising it, the way it existed for people who had given things that most people never have to give, and she'd felt, for the first time in 3 years, that she was in the right vicinity of where she was supposed to be. She pulled into her parking space. She sat for a moment with the engine off. Then she got out and went inside. The apartment was exactly as she'd left it, quiet, clean, unremarkable. She stood in the kitchen and drank a glass of water and looked at the space with the same focused attention she brought to patient bays and stairwells and parking lots at night, just looking, taking inventory, establishing the baseline. On the counter was the coffee she'd left that morning, cold and untouched. She'd made it at 5:30 a.m. and then not drunk it because she'd been focused on leaving early, on being the kind of person who arrived 13 minutes before their shift started. She poured it down the sink. She would make new coffee in the morning. There was a long career ahead. She understood that now in a way she hadn't fully understood it before yesterday. Or maybe she'd understood it and been afraid of it, which wasn't the same as not knowing. A long career in rooms where things were about to go wrong, identifying the thing that nobody else was looking at, doing the work that couldn't be done if you weren't built specifically to do it, and hadn't paid specifically the price of building yourself that way. It was hard work. It had always been hard work, and it would continue to be hard work, and there would be shifts that ended badly, and patients she couldn't save, and days where the exhaustion was physical and moral simultaneously, and the gap between what was possible and what had actually happened felt very large. She had learned, over years, to carry that gap without being crushed by it. Not to make peace with it. Peace was the wrong word. Too settled, too final. To carry it. To let it be what it was, which was the necessary weight of doing work that mattered in conditions that were never ideal with human beings who were never perfect, including herself. Especially herself. She was not a hero. Heroes were a shortcut, a way of making the story about one person's exceptional qualities so that everyone else could feel appropriately awed and appropriately off the hook. What she was a person who had trained hard and paid attention and made difficult decisions under pressure and gotten some of them right and some of them wrong, and had never, not once, been able to stop caring about the outcome. That wasn't heroism. That was just who she was. And who she was had not disappeared in 3 years of trying to be someone quieter. It had waited. It had been patient in the way that the things you are built for are patient, because they know they don't have to compete with anything. They just have to wait until the circumstances make themselves impossible to ignore. She went to bed, she slept. And in the morning, she drove back to Ironwood Veterans Medical Center and badged in at the side entrance and walked to the nursing station and picked up the first chart and got to work. That was all. That was everything. Some people spend years trying to become someone smaller than they are, quieter, safer, less likely to be needed in the middle of something difficult. It never works. Not because the trying isn't real, but because what you're built for doesn't forget you. It waits. It knows your name. And when the moment arrives, there's only one question that has ever mattered. When they needed someone who knew what to do, were you still the person who knew?